Secretary of Defense calls a female soldier stupid and lost command of the army instantly. It began as a routine assembly, a hall filled with polished boots, medals, and the weight of hierarchy. In the center stood Secretary Richard Hallstrom, a man who ruled not only with orders but with disdain. His voice carried arrogance, his words sharpened to belittle. When his gaze landed on a young soldier, Elena Ramirez, he delivered the insult like a blade. Stupid. The room laughed nervously, uncertain whether to share in his cruelty or hide from it. But what none of them expected was that this single insult would ignite a sequence that would shatter his empire of fear. Elena sat quietly, her hand brushing against an envelope concealed beneath her uniform, a truth that could shake the walls of power. At that moment, she was underestimated, invisible. Within minutes, she would bring the most powerful man in the room to his knees. If you want more stories where truth overturns arrogance, subscribe now, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because what followed was not just a clash of ranks, but a clash between lies and truth. And the moment Elena stood, the balance of power began to tilt forever. The hall was silent, except for the clicking of polished boots against the marble floor. Rows of generals and colonels filled the seats, their medals catching the glow of the chandeliers. Everyone waited for the arrival of one man, Secretary Richard Hallstrom. When he entered, he didn't just walk in. He conquered the space, chin lifted, eyes sweeping across the room like a ruler inspecting his kingdom. Conversations died instantly. This was his arena, and he thrived in the silence of authority. At the far side of the room sat Elena Ramirez. She was young, her uniform plain compared to the decorated brass surrounding her. Few even noticed her presence. To them, she was just another soldier, too ordinary to matter. But her posture betrayed a quiet defiance, shoulders square, eyes fixed on the stage. She wasn't here by accident. Inside her jacket, she carried an envelope that seemed heavier than her entire uniform, the weight of truth pressing against her chest. Hallstrom moved to the podium, his presence commanding. His voice, low and resonant, rolled through the hall. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Instead, he spoke with the cold arrogance of a man who believed his power was eternal. Strength, he said, comes from discipline. Weakness has no place in this army. His gaze swept across the audience until it landed on Elena. He paused, smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as though he had found his example of weakness. Elena felt his stare, but didn't flinch. She was used to being underestimated. From her first day in uniform, she had been labeled as too quiet, too young, too female to ever make a difference. Each insult had built a wall of resilience inside her. Still, she knew the storm was coming. The envelope under her jacket seemed to pulse with every word Hallstrom spoke, daring her to reveal its contents. But timing was everything. She couldn't move too soon. Hallstrom leaned forward, gripping the podium with both hands. Some soldiers, he said, his voice dripping with contempt, are simply stupid. He let the word hang in the air, sharp and cutting. Then, without hesitation, he nodded toward Elena. The hall erupted in nervous chuckles from those who wanted to please him, while others averted their eyes, unwilling to share in the cruelty. Elena sat still, but inside her pulse hammered. This wasn't humiliation. This was the spark she had expected. The laughter didn't last. An uncomfortable silence spread as the weight of his words settled over the room. Some officers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of pity and unease. Hallstrom straightened, proud of the dominance his insult had asserted. He believed he had crushed her spirit with one word. But if he had looked closer, he would have seen something he didn't expect. Elena's jaw tightening, her eyes burning with quiet fire. She thought of her father, who had told her stories about leaders who abuse their power and the people who dare to challenge them. One truth, he had said, can topple an empire built on lies. The envelope pressed harder against her ribs, as if reminding her of its presence. She had carried it for weeks, waiting for the moment when revealing it would have the greatest impact. And now, in front of the nation's most powerful man, she knew that moment was near. The hall seemed to shrink, the walls pulling closer as tension thickened. Elena could feel dozens of eyes on her, not in admiration, but in judgment. Was she going to react? Was she going to crumble? She remained motionless, letting Hallstrom think he had won. Every second of silence drew the net tighter around him. He believed he had humiliated her, but she was setting the stage for his downfall. Hallstrom's speech resumed, his arrogance unbroken. He had no idea that the balance of power in that room was shifting with every heartbeat. Elena's presence, once invisible, now carried an invisible gravity. The stage was set, the arrogant minister towering above and the silent soldier below, armed not with weapons but with truth. The clash between them was inevitable, and the first blow had already been struck. The secretary's smile sharpened as he sensed the room bending to his will. He circled the podium like a predator, tossing barbs disguised as doctrine. Discipline means cutting weakness before it spreads. Laughter scattered again, thinner than before. Elena's fingers brushed the inside of her jacket. Paper edges, a steady anchor. She slowed her breathing and watched the ripple of faces. Sycophants eager to echo him, veterans staring at the floor, a few younger officers blinking like they'd just seen a line crossed. The insult had landed. The room just hadn't decided what it meant yet. A colonel near the aisle rose, clear his throat. "Sir, with respect." Hallstrom's hand sliced the air. "Sit." The word cracked like a baton. The colonel froze, then sank back down, cheeks flushed. Elena clocked it. The fear wasn't about him. It was about the machine he commanded. Her jaw relaxed. She could almost hear her father again. Truth is heavier than rank. If you let it be. She straightened her shoulders, letting the envelope rest flat against her ribs, and felt the moment tilt toward her. Hallstrom prowled the front row. Some of you confuse empathy with leadership. He let the accusation hover over the uniforms. I do not. His gaze pinned Elena once more, proof that standards have slipped. She rose calmly, and the scrape of her chair sounded like a blade pulled from a sheath. The hall shifted. First hush, then a prickle of whispers. She didn't speak. She simply placed both hands on the back of the chair and met his eyes, steady and unafraid. A single beat of defiance rang louder than any speech. A younger captain coughed, then stood halfway, unsure. Hallstrom smirked at the hesitation, delighted by it. Questions? Or only apologies? The captain sat. Elena exhaled and stepped into the aisle. Each footfall announced intent without bravado. She passed rows of medals that refused to look at her, and faces that wanted to ask what she knew. When she reached the inner row, a security aide shifted to block her path. She stopped, offered her ID, and waited. The aide's eyes flicked to Hallstrom, seeking permission he didn't quite receive. Let her. Hallstrom's voice was amused, magnanimous in the way of men who think they can't be wounded. Elena advanced toward the podium, but stopped an arm's length away, still below the dais. Up close, the grandeur thinned. She saw a man propped up by the trembling of others. She withdrew the envelope. Its plain, unmarked face seemed almost indecent against the gleam of metals and marble. Gasps tremored along the back rows. Hallstrom's mouth twitched. Curiosity, annoyance, a flash of worry he buried too fast. He extended his hand as if granting mercy. Elena didn't move. "This is not mine," she said evenly. "It is the Army's." The line traveled like current. A few shoulders lifted, as if breathing got easier. She laid the envelope on the edge of the podium, where he'd have to reach down to take it. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Hallstrom chuckled, a showman reclaiming the stage, and plucked it up with 2 fingers as though it were beneath him. Paper whispered. The hall leaned in. He opened it. The first sheet was a copy of an operations directive bearing his signature. The second, a timeline. The third, a summary of casualties tied to an order that bypassed lawful review. Elena watched the blood leave his face, not in a dramatic drain, but in tiny, undeniable increments. A murmur flared and died. He flipped to a final page, an internal audit log he had assumed was buried, and his thumb hesitated just long enough for room to notice. He closed the folder with measured calm and smiled too slowly. "Forgery," he said. The word was soft, almost tender, and therefore terrifying. He tore the top page once, twice, as if shredding paper could reverse time. But 2 generals were already rising. Chairs scraped. A chain of command that had seemed monolithic a minute earlier suddenly showed seams. The aide who blocked Elena took an involuntary half-step toward her, then stopped, uncertain which gravity to obey. Hallstrom lifted the remaining pages higher, preparing to rip again. Hallstrom held the torn paper in his fist, smiling as if the act had erased the evidence. The hall bristled with unease, the kind that spreads when authority feels forced. Elena's voice cut through, calm and firm. "There are more copies." A ripple passed down the rows. Hallstrom froze for half a beat before regaining his smirk. "Lies," he said, but the room no longer swallowed his words as gospel. Several officers leaned forward, their curiosity outweighing their fear. The silence after her sentence was heavier than his entire speech. She extended her hand to the aide, who reluctantly accepted a second envelope from her pocket. He glanced at Hallstrom, then at the generals now standing, and passed it along. The secretary's jaw tightened. This was no longer a private challenge. It was a stage set for collapse. When he ripped open the second file, his eyes darted to names he recognized, orders he had signed. He snapped the folder shut, but the damage was done. Whispers ignited like brush fire across the hall. Elena felt her pulse slow. She had shifted the gravity of the room. Hallstrom slammed his palm on the podium, his control cracking. "These are fabrications," he thundered. Every signature forged, every log invented. Yet his voice no longer carried dominance. It trembled with desperation. Generals who once sat rigid now exchanged long, silent glances. A few scribbled notes. Others reached for their phones. Elena did not gloat. She simply stood, unblinking, a steady presence against his unraveling authority. The room was deciding where loyalty belonged. A lieutenant from the back called out, "Then prove it, sir. Bring the originals." The challenge sliced through protocol, but it landed. Hallstrom faltered, his mouth opening, then closing. His eyes swept the hall, searching for allies. None moved. The aide who had blocked Elena earlier stepped back, no longer shielding him. That subtle shift, the smallest betrayal, echoed louder than the lieutenant's demand. For the first time, Richard Hallstrom looked less like a titan and more like a man cornered. Elena stepped closer, her voice soft but piercing. The army deserves leaders who serve it, not themselves. Her words struck chords the documents alone could not. Officers lifted their heads. She wasn't just presenting evidence. She was naming what many had felt but never dared say aloud. Hallstrom tried to laugh it off, but the sound cracked, revealing the panic beneath. He grasped at the microphone, raising his voice to drown her out, but his echo bounced back hollow, failing to fill the hall the way it once had. In a final act of defiance, he hurled the envelope aside, paper scattering across the polished floor. Several officers rushed to pick them up, thumbing through the evidence with growing conviction. Each page made his protest sound thinner. Elena remained still, letting the storm swirl around her. She had no need to shout. The truth spoke louder than rage. For the first time, Hallstrom seemed smaller than the soldier he had mocked minutes earlier. The inversion was complete, though the verdict had yet to be spoken. General Marcus O'Neill, who had been silent until now, rose with the weight of his medals catching the light. He surveyed the room, then spoke with the authority only decades of service could grant. "This file," he said, holding up one of the scattered pages, "bears not only the secretary's seal, but mine. I was there, and these orders bypass lawful command." Gasps punctuated his words. The room tilted irreversibly. Elena's gamble had found its anchor in the general's testimony. Hallstrom's denial was no longer sustainable. Hallstrom shouted, "You betray me!" His voice cracked like broken glass. But the generals no longer faced him. They faced each other, whispering, calculating the fallout. Elena took a slow breath, realizing the danger wasn't over. Cornered men strike hardest. Yet she also felt the shift. She was no longer alone. The tide had turned, and the current was dragging Hallstrom toward collapse. She didn't need to push him further. The room itself was about to deliver judgment. Hallstrom's face burned red as he clutched the podium like it was the last anchor in a storm. His voice boomed, though it carried more panic than command. "Guards, arrest her." The order cracked through the hall, but the men stationed at the doors didn't move. Their eyes flicked between Hallstrom and Elena, caught in a silent tug-of-war. For the first time, hesitation hung where obedience once reigned. Elena stood unflinching, her hands at her sides, radiating calm in contrast to his unraveling fury. The silence deepened, louder than his command. One guard shifted his weight, but didn't step forward. Another shook his head almost imperceptibly. Hallstrom slammed his fist against the wood, rattling the microphone. "That's an order," he barked, but even he could hear the hollow echo in his voice. The authority that once bound the room now dangled by a thread. Elena's gaze swept across the soldiers, and though she said nothing, her quiet presence became the anchor they sought. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She finally spoke, her voice steady, carrying to every corner. "You know these signatures are real. You know what those orders cost." Her words struck deeper than the documents scattered on the floor. They pierced the conscience of the man who had carried out the commands without question. A murmur rippled, discomfort, recognition, guilt. Hallstrom shouted over it, but the crack in his control widened with every syllable. He was no longer the voice of discipline. He was a man begging to be obeyed. Hallstrom lunged from the podium, snatching one of the files from a general's hands. He held it aloft, shaking it in the air. "Lies!" he screamed, his face twisted with rage. But as his hand trembled, the paper seemed to expose him more than the words printed on it. Elena took a measured step forward, her boot striking the floor with finality. "If you believe they are lies," she said softly, "then why do you fear them so much?" The hall stilled, caught between his fury and her piercing calm. A major in the second row rose to his feet, his voice cracking the heavy quiet. "Sir, with all due respect, we deserve answers, not insults." The words were electric. Heads turned. Whispers grew louder. Hallstrom tried to shout the major down, but the man did not sit. Instead, more officers shifted in their seats, emboldened. Elena remained silent, letting the dissent grow like a fire she had sparked with a single spark of truth. Each second widened the gulf between Hallstrom and his army. Hallstrom's hands shook as he pointed at Elena. This is treason." His accusation was desperate, almost pitiful. Elena lifted her chin and answered with calm precision. "Treason is betraying the very people you swore to serve." The hall erupted, not in applause, but in sharp intakes of breath, gasps that carried judgment. The accusation he had thrown returned like a boomerang, striking him harder than it ever struck her. Officers leaned toward each other, nodding, their confidence in him unraveling with each word. A nervous laugh escaped Hallstrom, brittle and unconvincing. "You think you can turn them against me with cheap theatrics?" He spread his arms, but they no longer framed a leader. They framed a man grasping at ghosts of authority. Elena stayed rooted, her silence louder than his shouting. One by one, soldiers began to stand, not advancing, not threatening, but aligning their weight away from him. Their stance was a verdict without words. Hallstrom's eyes darted, realizing control was slipping through his fingers like sand. The final blow of this moment came not from Elena, but from the room itself. The chain of command that had once echoed his every word now hummed with defiance. His order had gone unfulfilled, his insults had been met with calm, and now even his accusations sounded empty. Elena remained the still center of the storm, her composure the sharpest weapon in the hall. The stage was set for judgment. Hallstrom cornered, his authority fractured, and his army already choosing who to believe. The hall trembled with silence, so thick it weighed on every chest. Then, like a knife cutting through, General Marcus O'Neill rose from his seat. His stature commanded instant attention. He held one of the scattered pages between his fingers, the seal catching the light. "This is genuine," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of decades in uniform. Gasps shot through the rows. Hallstrom staggered as though the ground had shifted beneath him, his last pillar of authority now crumbling from within his own ranks. Hallstrom's eyes blazed with betrayal. "You dare!" he spat, pointing a shaking finger at O'Neill. But the general didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his boots echoing like gavel strikes. "I was there when these orders were signed. They bypassed the chain of command, and men died because of them." The words struck like artillery, undeniable and devastating. Officers shifted uncomfortably. Others muttered agreement. The cracks in Halstrom's facade widened until it threatened to collapse entirely. He tried to laugh, a hollow, rasping sound. Conspiracies. You're all conspiring against me. The desperation stripped him bare. Elena remained silent, letting the moment devour him. Her stillness contrasted with his frantic gestures, each one a reminder that he was a drowning man thrashing in shallow water. The room, once a fortress of his power, had become a courtroom. Every officer present was a juror, and the verdict was rapidly aligning against him. The aide who once blocked Elena's path now bent down, gathering pages from the floor, and handing them not to Halstrom, but to O'Neill. That simple act was louder than any speech. It was a transfer of allegiance. Murmurs swelled into a chorus of discontent. Halstrom shouted, "I am your Secretary of Defense." But the title rang empty. The men who once saluted that title no longer moved. Their eyes said it all. His command had ended, even if the formal words hadn't yet been spoken. Elena finally broke her silence. Power belongs to the truth, not to you. Her voice was calm but resonant, slicing to the tension like steel. Every syllable carried the gravity of inevitability. Officers straightened, aligning themselves not with her rank but with her conviction. Halstrom's lips quivered, his bravado slipping into fear. For the first time, he looked small, diminished not by force, but by exposure. The man who once filled the room with arrogance now seemed swallowed by it. A colonel stepped forward, bowing his head slightly toward O'Neill. "What are your orders, General?" The shift was undeniable. The authority Halstrom demanded no longer existed. His fingers tightened on the podium as though it could anchor him to a vanishing empire. Elena's eyes met O'Neill's, and for a moment the hall held its breath. The decision was no longer about documents. It was about survival of honor versus the rot of corruption. O'Neill's voice thundered. "Secretary Halstrom, by the authority of this assembly, you are relieved of command, effective immediately." The words detonated through the hall, final and irrevocable. Soldiers moved forward, not toward Elena, but toward Halstrom. The man who once commanded nations now stood alone, his power stripped in an instant. His knees buckled slightly, as if the weight of his downfall had crushed him. Elena didn't smile. She simply stood steady, the living embodiment of justice fulfilled. As Halstrom was led away, the hall did not erupt in cheers. Instead, a solemn quiet filled the space, heavier and more meaningful than any applause. Officers turned to Elena, their eyes no longer dismissive but reverent. She had faced the arrogance of absolute power and brought it to its knees with nothing but truth. In that silence, respect was louder than any chant. The world had just witnessed the instant collapse of a man who thought himself untouchable. The guards flanked Halstrom, their grips firm but not cruel, guiding him toward the exit as though escorting the shadow of a man rather than the Secretary of Defense. His protest rang hollow, bouncing off marble and wood without finding listeners. The great hall that once bent under his command now stood indifferent. It silenced the sharpest sentence he could face. Elena remained still, her hands at her sides, eyes fixed forward, refusing to grant him even the satisfaction of anger. Her presence was a quiet verdict that ended his reign. Each step he took toward the door stripped another layer of authority from him. His medals, once glittering symbols of power, looked like empty ornaments clinging to a man who no longer deserved them. Generals who had once saluted him now looked past him, as if he were a ghost already forgotten. Elena exhaled slowly, her chest rising with the weight of vindication. She hadn't destroyed him with force. She had let the truth do its work. That truth now hung in the room heavier than any weapon. The door closed behind Halstrom, and the air shifted. Officers straightened in their seats, the tension finally easing but leaving behind a sobering clarity. The man who had mocked Elena as stupid had been dismantled by her calm resolve. Eyes turned toward her, not with pity, not with surprise, but with respect that could not be undone. For the first time, Elena felt the weight of recognition settle on her shoulders. It was not triumph she felt, but a responsibility that now belonged to her. General O'Neill addressed the assembly, his voice carrying steadiness. "We have witnessed what arrogance blinds and what courage restores. This institution survives not on fear, but on truth." His gaze swept the hall, but lingered on Elena. A murmur of agreement rose among the officers. Elena bowed her head slightly, not in deference, but as acknowledgment of the shared burden they all now carried. Her defiance had reshaped the room, yet she knew the work of rebuilding would be harder than this single victory. As the hall began to disperse, several younger soldiers approached her quietly, their faces marked by gratitude and admiration. One whispered, "You spoke for all of us." Another saluted, crisp and deliberate, an honor she had never expected to receive. Elena returned the gesture with humility, her eyes shimmering but her voice steady. "I only spoke the truth." It was a simple phrase, but in that moment, it felt like the cornerstone of a new foundation laid in the ruins of Hallstrom's fall. Outside, the air was crisp, the sky wide and mercilessly clear. Elena stepped into the courtyard, the sounds of boots behind her fading into the distance. She lifted her eyes to the flag fluttering overhead and felt a mix of relief and weariness wash through her. The cost of what had unfolded would ripple beyond this day. Investigations, reforms, suspicion. Yet beneath all of it was hope, fragile but undeniable, that integrity had won at least one decisive battle. She thought again of her father's words. One truth can topple an empire built on lies. Today, she had seen it happen. She hadn't sought glory, but glory had found her in the quiet strength of defiance. Though fear had shadowed every step, she had not allowed it to dictate her actions. Instead, she had stood in a room filled with power and proven that justice could speak even through the smallest voice. That lesson would remain long after Hallstrom's name had faded. The finality of the day weighed heavy, but so did the promise it carried. Elena walked across the courtyard, her steps slower now, every movement grounded by the realization that courage was not about winning battles, but about choosing truth when silence was safer. She had chosen, and the world had changed, however slightly, because of it. For once, the word soldier felt less like a label imposed and more like a calling fulfilled. This story of defiance reminds us all, even the most arrogant powers can collapse in an instant when confronted with truth. If Elena's courage moved you, make sure to subscribe for more stories that reveal the strength hidden in unlikely places. Leave a like and share your thoughts. Your voice matters here. And if you want to stand with us, consider becoming a channel member to help us bring more stories of resilience and justice to life. More revelations like this are on the way. Don't miss the next one.